Italy shaped the modern world for 2,000 years, yet failed to unite itself for most of that time. And that contradiction still defines the country today. America is named after an Italian. In the early 1500s, a German mapmaker labeled the new continents after Amerigo Vespucci, a Florentine explorer who realized these lands were not Asia, but something entirely new, and the name stuck. Between 1880 and 1924, roughly 4.5 million Italians crossed the Atlantic to the United States, most of them from the poor South looking for work and land they could not find at home. They settled first in New York and Boston, before spreading to Philadelphia and Chicago as industrial jobs expanded across the Northeast and Midwest. Today, roughly 17 million Americans claim Italian ancestry, and New York alone rivals Italy's largest cities in Italian-descended population. Romans built the legal and engineering systems that structured Western civilization, while Renaissance city-states invented modern banking and exported art that reshaped European culture. Yet the people who created these systems could never govern themselves as one nation until 1861. That contradiction defines Italian history, and understanding why requires starting with geography. Italy is a peninsula shaped like a boot, extending into the Mediterranean Sea, with the Alps forming a massive wall across the north that kept Italy separate from the rest of Europe while also blocking internal unity. For most of history, crossing those mountains took enormous effort, so northern regions developed connections to Alpine trade routes rather than to Rome or Naples, creating a pattern of fragmentation that would persist for millennia. South of the Alps, the Apennine Mountains run down the center of the country like a spine, splitting the east coast from the west. A farmer near Rome had little reason to interact with a farmer near Venice because the mountains made travel difficult and expensive. Communities developed independently over centuries, creating local identities and dialects so distinct that people from different regions could barely understand each other. The country stretches roughly 1,200 kilometers from north to south, but climate and terrain divide it more sharply than distance alone suggests. Northern Italy contains the Po Valley, a flat and fertile plain, where cities like Milan and Turin grew wealthy from farming and later from industry, with a climate resembling Oregon that provided cool winters and enough rain for dense agriculture. Southern Italy is different because the land around Naples and Sicily is drier and more mountainous, with Calabria at the toe of the boot experiencing summers as hot as Southern California. Farming was harder and wealth accumulated more slowly, which created two different Italys that unification would never fully merge. Coastlines run along both sides of the peninsula, giving Italy over 7,000 kilometers of shore where coastal cities looked outward for trade rather than inward toward each other. And that outward orientation made them wealthy and independent. Venice looked east toward Asia, Genoa looked west toward North Africa, and Naples focused on the eastern Mediterranean, each port building its own network with no reason to integrate. The sea pulled Italian cities apart as effectively as the mountains did. Geography created a formula that would repeat for 2,000 years. Mountains blocked central authority. Fertile plains created wealthy cities that resisted outside control, and long coastlines encouraged trade with distant partners rather than political unity at home. Italy became rich in parts, but divided as a whole. People lived on the Italian peninsula long before Rome existed, and those earlier civilizations left patterns that Rome would inherit. Around 2,500 years ago, the Etruscans controlled much of central Italy, building cities near modern Florence and Rome, while developing their own writing system and creating political structures that later influenced Roman government. Think of them as Italy's version of pre-colonial Native American civilizations, with complex societies that later powers absorbed rather than erased. Greek settlers arrived in the south around the same time, founding cities along the coast of Sicily and Calabria, including Syracuse and Taranto. And these colonies connected Italy to wider Mediterranean trade networks. bringing new technologies, crops, and political ideas into the peninsula through its southern ports. Northern regions interacted with Celtic peoples from the Alps, while southern coasts connected to Greece and North Africa, and central Italy linked these different worlds through overland trade routes. When Rome began expanding, it did not build on empty land because cities already existed. Trade routes already moved goods across the region, and political traditions already shaped how communities governed themselves. Rome absorbed these systems rather than inventing everything from scratch, which accelerated its rise beyond what any single city could have achieved alone. And that inheritance allowed Rome to solve Italy's fragmentation by force, though that unity would last only while Rome itself remained strong. The city started small on the Tiber River, and around 2,500 years ago, the Romans overthrew their king and created a republic where elected officials shared power with a senate of wealthy families, a system designed to prevent any single person from dominating for long. Americans might recognize echoes of this structure in their own constitution, which the founders partly modeled on Roman ideas about balanced government. The Roman system helped the city expand because it offered conquered peoples something other empires did not: pay taxes, follow Roman laws, serve in the army when called, and in return you could eventually become a Roman citizen with full legal rights. This turned former enemies into future soldiers and gave conquered peoples a reason to stay loyal, so each war funded the next, as taxes from new territories paid for more roads and more legions. Roman armies operated differently from their rivals because soldiers trained using the same methods across all legions and fought in disciplined formations that commanders could rely on, while roads tied the growing territory together as Roman engineers built straight, durable highways connecting distant towns to the capital. Armies could march quickly to trouble spots, while merchants moved goods reliably, and information traveled faster than in neighboring societies, creating a feedback loop where conquest brought territory, territory brought taxes, taxes funded armies, and armies enabled more conquest. Within a few centuries, Rome dominated the entire Italian peninsula in an unprecedented achievement that overcame the geographic barriers dividing Italian communities for millennia through military force and political integration, creating a unified state where none had existed before. But Roman unity depended entirely on Roman power. The Republic eventually broke down as successful generals became too powerful and wealthy families competed for control through civil wars that tore the state apart during the first century before the Common Era. Augustus ended the chaos by becoming the first emperor around 2,000 years ago, keeping the appearance of republican government while concentrating real power in his own hands. The empire expanded far beyond Italy, controlling territory from Britain in the northwest to Egypt in the southeast at its peak, with Spain marking the western edge and the borders of Persia marking the east, so the Mediterranean Sea became a Roman lake. To put this in perspective, Rome governed an area comparable to a modern great power, spread across 3 continents with far more geographic and cultural diversity. Infrastructure held this vast territory together because Roman roads eventually stretched over 80,000 kilometers across 3 continents. Aqueducts carried fresh water to cities, while ports connected distant provinces by sea, and engineers invented concrete that hardened underwater for construction projects impossible with earlier technology. Roman law created predictability across the empire so that contracts meant the same thing in Britain as in Syria, allowing merchants to do business across vast distances because the legal framework protected their transactions. Stone roads stretched across mountain passes and coastal plains. Aqueducts carried water against Mediterranean skies, and Roman columns rose in cities from the Scottish lowlands to the Egyptian desert. Challenges grew over time because defending long borders required expensive armies that strained the treasury. Emperors struggled to control distant generals who commanded their troops' loyalty, and plagues reduced the population until administrative systems designed for a smaller territory could no longer manage an empire spanning 3 continents. The western half collapsed in the 5th century as invasions, economic problems, and political instability combined to break Roman control over Western Europe. And when Roman authority collapsed, nothing replaced the centralized system that had held the peninsula together. Each time Italy unified, geography and local power structures eventually pulled it apart again. When Roman authority collapsed, Italy returned to its natural pattern of fragmentation as local powers replaced central rule. Germanic tribes moved into Italy and established their own kingdoms, with the Ostrogoths ruling for several decades before the Lombards invaded from the north and seized much of the peninsula. Power fragmented into local pieces as Lombard dukes controlled the north, Byzantine governors held onto southern regions and coastal cities, and the Pope in Rome claimed spiritual authority while gradually building political power over nearby territories. Imagine the United States dissolving into 50 separate countries, each with its own army and foreign policy. That approximates what happened to Roman Italy. The Franks invaded in the late 700s and absorbed the Lombard kingdom, with their leader Charlemagne receiving a crown from the Pope and claiming to revive the Roman Empire, but his empire fragmented after his death. Foreign rulers came and went while local lords rose and fell, but no one built a lasting Italian state because the geography that had always divided Italy prevented any new empire from forming. Division became the default because no single power could hold the peninsula, but from that division came unexpected strength. By the 1100s, Italian cities had grown powerful enough to defy outside control because their wealth made them difficult to conquer and expensive to hold. Milan and Florence became independent or nearly independent states. Venice and Genoa followed, and each city governed itself with its own armies and its own ambitions, because mountains made conquest difficult, while wealth from trade made independence possible. Venice built a maritime empire from islands in a lagoon, where canals replaced streets and merchants moved through the city by boat, dominating the routes connecting Europe to Asia while shipping spices and silk westward, and developing sophisticated banking and insurance systems to manage the risks of long-distance trade. In many ways, Venice functioned like an early version of Wall Street, pioneering financial instruments that would later spread worldwide. Genoa competed with Venice for Mediterranean trade by establishing outposts from North Africa to the Black Sea coast and fighting wars over commercial routes, while Florence took a different path by becoming a centre for wool production and banking, with Florentine bankers lending money to kings and popes across Europe. The Medici family rose to dominate Florence through their banking network, using wealth to buy political influence, and Milan controlled the fertile Po Valley and built strength through agriculture and armaments, with Milanese workshops producing weapons that equipped armies across the continent. These cities did not cooperate because they did not need to, forming temporary alliances against common threats, then turning on each other when the danger passed, while wealthy families competed for control within each city, and mercenary armies fought for whoever paid them. The same competition that made Italy rich also made unity impossible. In Venetian canals, merchants negotiated contracts from boats, while church bells echoed across the lagoon. In Florentine piazzas, bankers counted gold as artists sketched cathedral domes rising against Tuscan hills. But competition drove innovation. The 1400s and 1500s transformed Italy into the cultural centre of Europe because wealthy cities had money to spend and powerful families wanted to display their status. Florence led the way as its piazzas became public stages, where bankers, artists, and politicians displayed power through architecture, sculpture, and patronage. The Medici used their banking fortune to support artists and scholars, commissioning work that demonstrated their influence, while other wealthy families competed to match them, creating demand for creative work on an enormous scale. Artists developed new techniques in response to this demand, as painters learned to create the illusion of depth on flat surfaces using perspective. sculptors studied human anatomy to make their figures more realistic, and architects revived Roman styles while inventing new approaches to design. Leonardo da Vinci worked in Florence and Milan, painting masterpieces while studying engineering and anatomy, and Michelangelo carved the statue of David in Florence before painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in Rome. Ideas spread beyond art as scholars rediscovered ancient Greek and Roman texts that had been forgotten in Western Europe for centuries, and developed new approaches to education, politics, and philosophy in a movement called humanism, which emphasized human potential and individual achievement rather than purely religious frameworks. American ideas about individual rights and human dignity trace partly back to these Renaissance thinkers. Printing technology arrived from Germany and accelerated the spread of ideas by making books cheaper and more available, so knowledge that had once been locked in monastery libraries reached wider audiences. Science began separating from philosophy as Galileo used observation and experiment to study motion and astronomy, laying foundations for modern scientific practice. Workshop studios filled with marble dust and oil paint scent, where apprentices ground pigments as masters debated perspective, and cathedral scaffolding rose toward heaven as architects sketched new visions of sacred space. Banking innovations spread from Florence across Europe as double-entry bookkeeping allowed merchants to track complex transactions. Bills of exchange enabled payments across long distances without moving physical currency, and insurance contracts spread risk across multiple investors. Other European powers noticed what Italy had produced, and French and Spanish kings invaded seeking wealth and territory, while also bringing Italian artists and architects back to their own courts, spreading Renaissance ideas north and west. Italy exported systems, not just art. Banking, scientific method, political philosophy, and modern aesthetics all emerged from this peninsula and spread outward. But the same division that drove innovation made Italy vulnerable. Foreign powers exploited Italian fragmentation because no unified Italian state could resist them. France and Spain both claimed rights to Italian territories, and starting in the 1490s they invaded repeatedly because Italian city-states could not coordinate their defense, trusting each other less than they trusted foreign invaders. Spain eventually won control over much of the peninsula, and by the middle of the 1500s, Spanish rulers governed Naples and Sicily, while Milan and Sardinia followed. The Pope controlled territories in central Italy, while Venice and a few smaller states remained independent but diminished. Imagine if Texas, California, and New York were each ruled by different foreign countries, while only a few small states remained self-governing, and that describes Italy for the next 3 centuries. Spanish rule lasted nearly 200 years, with governors sent from Madrid making decisions for Italian territories, while taxes flowed out to fund Spanish wars elsewhere in Europe, causing local economies to stagnate under foreign administration. Austria replaced Spain as the dominant foreign power in the early 1700s, after the Habsburgs, one of Europe's most powerful royal families, took control of Milan and Naples following a war over the Spanish succession. Italy remained a collection of states ruled by outsiders or local aristocrats aligned with foreign powers. Napoleon changed everything briefly as French armies swept through Italy in the 1790s, overthrowing old rulers and reorganizing territories. Napoleon combined several regions into a single kingdom of Italy, the first time that name had applied to a unified state in over 1,000 years. But his empire collapsed and the old rulers returned. Foreign powers replaced each other because no unified Italian state could resist them. For 3 centuries, Italy produced genius, but could not govern itself. Nationalism changed the equation because it reframed Italians as a single people who should share a single state. The idea of a unified Italy grew during the early 1800s as writers and activists argued that people who shared a language and culture should share a government. This movement became known as the Risorgimento, meaning resurgence or revival, with the concept imported from France and Germany, where nationalism had already reshaped politics. Piedmont led the unification effort because this small kingdom in the northwest had its own army, its own government, and ambitions beyond its borders. Think of Piedmont as Italy's Virginia, a relatively prosperous region that provided leadership for a larger national project. Count Camillo Cavour became prime minister in 1852 and began planning how to expand Piedmont into a larger Italian state. Cavour was a diplomat and strategist who allied Piedmont with France against Austria, which controlled much of northern Italy. And in 1859, French and Piedmontese armies defeated Austrian forces in a short war so that Piedmont gained Lombardy, the wealthy region around Milan. Giuseppe Garibaldi provided the military force in the south by leading 1,000 volunteer soldiers to Sicily in 1860, which was ruled by a Spanish Bourbon king. But the expedition succeeded beyond expectations as local populations joined the revolt. Within months, Garibaldi controlled Sicily and Naples, the entire southern half of the peninsula. Cavour moved quickly to absorb these territories before Garibaldi could establish a rival government by organizing votes that favored unification under the Piedmontese king. And in 1861, the Kingdom of Italy was officially declared with Victor Emmanuel II as king. Turin served as the first capital, later replaced by Florence and then Rome. But Italy was unified by political elites, not by shared national identity. The north had factories and railroads, while the south had poverty and poor roads. Northern cities industrialized quickly as Turin became a manufacturing center and Milan grew into a financial hub, with textile factories and steel mills employing thousands of workers and making the north resemble industrializing regions in France and Germany. The south remained agricultural and poor because large estates dominated the countryside, owned by aristocratic families who lived elsewhere and invested little in the land. Peasants worked small plots or labored for wages that barely covered survival, while roads stayed bad, schools stayed scarce, and government services barely reached rural areas. The economic divide between north and south that geography had created over millennia did not disappear because a king declared unity, and that divide pushed millions to leave. Emigration became a mass movement between 1880 and 1924, as roughly 4.5 million Italians left for the United States alone, while millions more went to Argentina and Brazil, emptying entire villages of most of their young men. They traveled on steamships that made Atlantic crossings cheap and fast, allowing a peasant from Calabria to reach New York in 2 weeks for a few months' wages. Chain migration took hold as one family member went first, found work, sent money home, and pulled relatives into the same neighborhoods. Most came from southern Italy, leaving small stone villages on Sicilian hillsides where farmland was scarce and opportunities were limited to subsistence agriculture. And they arrived at ports like New York, where Ellis Island processed millions of newcomers. Italian immigrants concentrated in cities as New York received the largest numbers, while Boston and Philadelphia developed significant communities, and Chicago and San Francisco followed. Neighborhoods like the North End in Boston, Little Italy in Manhattan, and the Hill in St. Louis became centers of Italian-American life. Work was often manual labor as Italian immigrants built roads and subways while buildings rose from their labor, and they worked in mines and factories while some opened small businesses selling food and wine and others became barbers and tailors using skills brought from home. Discrimination was common because newspapers portrayed Italians as criminal and inferior, while employment ads specified no Italians, and social acceptance came slowly. The second and third generations assimilated while maintaining connections to heritage, learning English in schools, pursuing professional careers, and moving to suburbs as intermarriage with other ethnic groups increased. The Italian government did little to stop the outflow, because emigration reduced pressure on the land and brought money back through remittances, but it also drained the country of workers and delayed reforms that might have addressed southern poverty. Italy exported people the way it had once exported ideas, generously and at great cost to itself. Italy entered World War I in 1915, hoping to gain territory from Austria, but the war went poorly, with over 600,000 Italian soldiers dead, and when peace came, Italy received less territory than promised, leaving the nation humiliated and economically devastated. The chaos of inflation, unemployment, and strikes created demand for order, and one man promised to deliver it. The post-war period brought inflation that destroyed savings, unemployment that rose sharply, and strikes that shut down factories, with socialists gaining support in industrial cities, while landowners feared revolution. Benito Mussolini offered an alternative because he had started as a socialist but broke with the movement during the war, and by 1919 he was organizing armed squads called Black Shirts, who attacked socialist meetings and broke strikes. Wealthy industrialists and landowners supported him because he promised to restore order. In 1922, Mussolini marched on Rome with thousands of supporters, and the king could have ordered the army to stop them, but feared civil war. So instead, he appointed Mussolini prime minister. Within a few years, Mussolini had dismantled democracy and established a dictatorship. And after centuries of division, Italy tried to achieve unity through authoritarian force. The regime was brutal, as political opponents were imprisoned or exiled while some were killed. The press was censored, independent unions were abolished, and secret police monitored the population. At the same time, the government launched major projects as engineers drained marshes south of Rome to create farmland, while workers built highways and railways, and the state invested in heavy industry. Unemployment fell during the early 1930s, while other countries, including the United States, suffered through the Great Depression. Mussolini pursued imperial ambitions, and in 1935, Italian forces invaded Ethiopia using poison gas against poorly armed defenders. The League of Nations, an early attempt at international cooperation that preceded the United Nations, condemned the invasion but took no effective action, so Italy withdrew from the League and allied with Nazi Germany. Many Italians supported the regime in its early years, while others kept quiet out of fear, and some resisted through underground networks that would later become important. Mussolini joined World War II in June 1940, expecting a quick German victory, and Italian forces invaded France and Greece, while campaigns in North Africa followed. But most went badly because the military was poorly equipped and poorly led. Defeats mounted as British forces pushed Italians out of East Africa, while the Greek invasion stalled and required German rescue, and Italian armies in North Africa collapsed repeatedly. Germany arrived to stabilize the front, but Italy became a junior partner rather than an equal ally, and Americans would encounter Italian forces in North Africa and Sicily, where US troops played major roles in the Allied advance. The home front suffered as Allied bombing destroyed factories and cities while food became scarce, and by 1943, many Italians wanted out of the war. In July 1943, Allied forces invaded Sicily and within weeks controlled the island, so the fascist Grand Council voted to remove Mussolini from power, and the king had him arrested. Italy tried to switch sides by signing an armistice with the Allies in September, but German forces reacted quickly by occupying central and northern Italy, freeing Mussolini and installing him as head of a puppet state in the north. Italy became a battlefield as Allied forces landed on the mainland and pushed slowly northward against German resistance, destroying towns and killing civilians over nearly 2 years. Resistance movements formed in German-occupied areas, with partisans attacking supply lines and ambushing patrols, while Germans responded with brutal reprisals against civilian populations. Mussolini's puppet state collapsed in April 1945 as German forces retreated, and partisans captured Mussolini and executed him, hanging his body upside down in Milan for crowds who had once cheered his speeches. Bombed-out factories stood silent in northern cities while rubble filled streets where fascist parades had marched, and Italian families picked through ruins, searching for anything that remained. The war cost Italy roughly 500,000 lives while cities lay in ruins. The economy had collapsed, and the monarchy was discredited. The attempt to create unity through authoritarian power ended in national collapse. But fragmentation did not disappear. It simply changed form. Italy had to rebuild from collapse for the second time in a century, and this time the people would choose what came next. In June 1946, Italians voted on their future, choosing to abolish the monarchy and establish a republic, while women voted in a national election for the first time, and the king went into exile. A new constitution took effect in 1948, creating a parliamentary system with a president as head of state and a prime minister leading the government while guaranteeing civil liberties, establishing regional governments, and declaring Italy a republic founded on labour. Cold War pressures shaped politics because the United States feared communist influence in Western Europe, and Italy had a large and well-organized communist party that might win elections, so American aid and covert support helped Christian Democrats defeat the communists in the crucial 1948 election. Christian Democrats dominated Italian politics for the next 40 years by governing through coalitions with smaller parties and shifting alliances to maintain power, and prime ministers came and went frequently, but the same party remained in control. Italy joined Western alliances as a founding member of NATO in 1949, the military alliance that bound Western democracies together against the Soviet Union. Italy also joined the European Coal and Steel Community in 1951, an economic partnership that later evolved into the European Union. American aid helped rebuild the economy as Marshall Plan funds supported reconstruction of factories and infrastructure. And Italy received over $1 billion in aid between 1948 and 1952. The political system had weaknesses because coalition governments were unstable. Corruption spread through networks linking politicians and business leaders. Organized crime infiltrated public contracts, and the South remained poorer than the North, so democracy survived, but fragmentation returned through coalitions and regional divides. Then the economic miracle began as Italy experienced explosive growth during the 1950s and 60s, transforming a war-devastated country into one of the world's largest industrial economies. Manufacturing led the transformation as Fiat turned Turin into an automobile capital, much as Detroit defined American car production, producing cars that ordinary families could afford, while exports reached markets across Europe. Other manufacturers built motorcycles and appliances as Italian factories became known for combining quality with competitive prices. Fashion and design became major industries as Milan emerged as a global fashion center alongside Paris, with Italian designers creating clothing and shoes that commanded premium prices worldwide, while industrial design extended this reputation to furniture and lighting. Workers moved from countryside to cities as southern Italians migrated north to find factory jobs in Turin and Milan, transforming both regions because northern cities grew rapidly while southern villages lost population. Infrastructure improved as the government built highways connecting major cities, similar to the American interstate highway system being constructed during the same years, while new housing accommodated growing urban populations and electricity reached rural areas. Living standards rose dramatically as families that had survived on bread and vegetables began eating meat regularly while buying refrigerators and televisions. Car ownership spread beyond the wealthy, and vacations at the beach became possible for working families. Fiat assembly lines hummed in Turin, while families gathered around new television sets in Milan apartments, and Vespas buzzed through Roman streets as young Italians tasted prosperity their grandparents never imagined. The miracle had limits because growth concentrated in the north, while the south fell further behind in relative terms. And the same regional divide that geography had created centuries earlier continued shaping economic development. Modern Italy inherits those ancient patterns, and the same forces that shaped Roman fragmentation continue shaping Italian politics today. The country remains wealthy, but persistent problems limit its potential because the north-south divide has never closed. Unemployment runs higher in the south, incomes remain lower, and young people leave for northern cities or foreign countries to find opportunities. Government debt accumulated over decades because politicians spent more than the country earned to fund services and buy political support. Population decline began as women had fewer children, and young people delayed families due to expensive housing and uncertain jobs, while political fragmentation persisted as coalitions collapsed and reforms stalled. This is why Italy struggles to reform as quickly as Germany or France, even when the problems are obvious and the solutions are known. Organized crime remains a factor, particularly in southern regions, with criminal organizations extracting money from businesses through extortion while infiltrating public contracts. And decades of law enforcement efforts have weakened these groups, but not eliminated them. Yet Italy continues to shape global culture far beyond its population or economic weight. Italian food became a global standard because migrants carried their recipes with them. So pizza, pasta, olive oil, and espresso became symbols of quality and sophistication worldwide, while Italian restaurants operate in cities across every continent. Fashion remains centered on Milan, where Italian brands like Gucci and Prada set trends copied by manufacturers everywhere, while Italian leather goods command premium prices, and the phrase "made in Italy" signals quality. Automobiles carry Italian prestige, as Ferrari and Lamborghini define supercar performance for enthusiasts worldwide, including the Americans who buy them in large numbers, while even Fiat benefits from Italian design heritage, and Vespa scooters became symbols of urban mobility. Design extends beyond fashion and cars as Italian furniture fills high-end homes and Italian industrial designers work for companies worldwide. Cinema contributed iconic films and filmmakers as directors like Federico Fellini and Sergio Leone influenced generations of movie makers, including American directors like Martin Scorsese and Quentin Tarantino, and Italian neo-realism, a film movement emphasizing ordinary people and real locations rather than studio glamour, shaped post-war cinema worldwide. Opera originated in Italy as composers like Verdi and Puccini created works still performed in opera houses worldwide, while Italian musical terminology remains the standard vocabulary for classical musicians everywhere. Today, roughly 17 million Americans claim Italian ancestry, making Italian Americans one of the largest ethnic groups in the country, with New York and New Jersey having the highest concentrations, while cultural influence extends through food and entertainment, and public life reflects this heritage in politics, business, and the arts. Italy today is a country of roughly 60 million people, smaller than its peak population and shrinking slowly, using the euro as currency and operating as a parliamentary republic. Four forces shaped this history. Geography divided the peninsula into regions that developed separately for millennia, while power shifted constantly between local rulers and foreign empires until 19th century nationalism created a fragile kingdom. Economics ran on different tracks in north and south, creating imbalances that persist today, and culture produced exports that influenced the world, from Roman law to Renaissance art to modern fashion and food. Yet Italy remains significant far beyond its size, ranking among the largest economies in the world, while holding more UNESCO World Heritage Sites than any other country, with cultural exports shaping daily life for billions of people, and diaspora communities influencing the development of nations across the Americas. If your family came from the villages of Calabria or Sicily, if you have eaten pasta or pizza, driven a Fiat, or dreamed of a Ferrari, worn Italian leather, or watched a Scorsese film, studied Roman history, or admired Renaissance art, you have encountered Italy's influence. For 2,000 years, Italy exported systems to the world while struggling to unite itself at home, and that contradiction still defines the country today.